Hi, everyone. I'm Alon Confino. I'm the director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at UMass. And it is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome you to our event today, which will discuss Tom Kohut's book, Empathy and the Historical Understanding of the Human Past. It looks like this. Before we start, just a few housekeeping things. The event is recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel thereafter. I'm reminding you that if you want to join our email list, please write something in the chat or write the Institute, and you can also follow us on Facebook. At the end of the presentations, we'll have a Q&A. Please write your questions at the Q&A tab at the bottom, not at the chat. Let me also remind you of our two forthcoming events. On December 9th at noon Eastern Time, we're going to have a panel discussion of the book by Shai Chazkani, Dear Palestine, The Social History of the 1948 War. And on December 14th, we are going to have a conversation with Esra Ozurek on anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and Holocaust remembrance in Germany. Esra is a distinguished professor at Cambridge, and this event is part of the Encounters series that this institute, together with the Avraham Harman Institute for Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University, directed by Amos Goldberg, is having every year. And now it is my great honor to present Tom Kohut, who is the Sue and Edgar Wachenheim III Professor of History at Williams College in Massachusetts. A historian with psychoanalytic training, he has published, among others, A German Generation and the Experiential History of the 20th Century. He is currently a member of the Council of Scholars, which advises the Erikson Institute at Riggs, and he is also president of the board of the Freud Foundation, as Freudian slip, the Freud Foundation in the United States. Jane Tillman is the Evelyn Stephenson Neff Director of the Erikson Institute for Education, Research and Advocacy of the Austin Riggs Center. A board-certified clinical psychologist and a psychoanalyst, Jane is an assistant clinical professor at the Yale Child Study Center and a teaching associate in psychiatry at the Cambridge Health Alliance of Harvard Medical School. Frank Bies is professor of modern European history with an emphasis on 20th century Germany at the University of California, San Diego. His book, German Angst, Fear and Democracy in the Federal Republic of Germany, was published in 2020 by Oxford University Press. And finally, Marion Kaplan is Skirball Professor of Modern Jewish History at New York University. She is a three-time winner of National Jewish Book Award. Her last book is Hitler's Jewish Refugees, Hope and Anxiety in Portugal, 1940 to 1945, published by Yale University Press in 2020, which we had a book event for last year. So this is truly a distinguished panel to discuss a book that I read and have read and assigned to my classes. As I told the panelists, my seminar is going to read this book tomorrow, and we are looking forward to our discussion. We'll start with Tom, who will give us a brief overview. Then we'll have Jane, Frank, Marion, then Tom will respond, and we'll open the floor for the Q&A. Tom, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for for participating in this. And I'll just, I'm gonna have some remarks that I'm gonna read, partly because I wanna be efficient and partly because this is not an easy subject to talk about. It's highly theoretical, it's abstract and complicated. And so I think that's easier, but I just wanted to say informally, why I chose to study empathy. And part of it was that it seems that empathy is just ubiquitous in our culture. It's ubiquitous in popular culture. It's even ubiquitous, I think, academically. But my sense was that for much of the time, the concept is really ill-defined, capacious, squishy. It's really unclear what people mean by the word empathy. And so the primary hope I had in writing the book was that we would be exactly having discussions like this, where we would be thinking systematically and discussing what empathy is and what it does for us as historians and students of human beings generally, and what some of the problems that are associated with empathy might be. So the book is a success already because we're having the discussion. The other thing is, I think my teaching and my scholarship, I've always thought, was characterized by empathy, but I'd never actually thought very much about what that meant. And so the book gave me a chance to think about that. As Alon mentioned, I have a psychoanalytic training as a research candidate at the Cincinnati Psychoanalytic Institute, in addition to my PhD in history, which is my primary identity. But I'm not wanting really to have a split personality. I was trying always to see how the two ways of thinking about people could be brought together. And it seemed to me that empathy was one way that psychoanalysis and psychotherapy on the one hand and history on the other hand kind of come together, because both, I think, use empathy to understand people. And finally, on a very personal level, this gave me a chance to engage intellectually with my father, who was the psychoanalyst Thomas Kohut. And I think more than any other psychoanalyst, my father is associated with empathy. And in fact, he thought that empathy and introspection were what defined psychoanalysis as a field of inquiry into the inner life of human beings. So that's my informal remarks. And now I'm going to more formally talk about some of what's in the book. Because empathy seems at once omnipresent in public and academic discourse, and also such a fuzzy and capacious concept, my book seeks in part to be a kind of primer on empathy for historians and others in the humanities and social sciences who seek to know and understand human beings. Thus, much of the book presents the ideas of others in a variety of disciplines relating to empathy. Perhaps the central point I seek to make in the book, in fact, comes from my father, namely his distinction between what he called the extrospective observational position, where one views the other from without, and the empathic observational position, where one thinks and even feels one's way inside the experience of the other. Empathy, defined as imagining oneself in the place of the other, is, I argue throughout the book, a legitimate and important way for historians to know and understand the people of the past. I cannot emphasize strongly enough, however, that legitimate and valuable history can be written from both observational positions. Some historians occupy the position of the external observer almost exclusively. Historians who are interested in human activity, for example, do not need to adopt the empathic observational position, that is, the position of the historical subject. Indeed, the perspective of the historical subject can actually be misleading, since past people were often unaware of the forces, the structures, the processes, or the discourses that shaped their lives. Historians who are interested in experience, however, need, I think, to adopt the empathic position, the position of the historical subject. Nevertheless, even while empathizing, historians must remain themselves in order to recognize what belongs to the self and what belongs to the other. It is the awareness of the distinction between self and other that distinguishes empathy from contagion, where the emotional state of others infects the self to become one's own emotional experience, from merger, where one's self becomes one with the self of the other, and from identification, where one experiences oneself as being the same as the other. In all three cases, contagion, merger, and identification, the boundary between self and other is erased, and the observer loses his or her independent sense of self. There is no loss of self in empathy. Because it is partial and attenuated, there is always an awareness and appreciation of difference in empathy. The lack of a clear distinction between self and other is at the root, I think, of the persistent tendency wrongly to conflate empathy and sympathy. Empathy is not sympathy, for as our host, Alon, eloquently put it, quotes, "One can understand without forgiving and forgive without understanding." Being clear about one's observational position lifts the fog of confusion surrounding empathy and sympathy. When I empathize, I leave my own subjective position to adopt in my imagination the position of the other. I seek to align myself with the other mentally, and that I try to see the world from the other's perspective, and emotionally, and that I try to feel something of what the other feels. When I sympathize, I regard and react to the other from my own subjective position. I do not seek to adopt the position of the person with whom I sympathize. The other person may feel sorrow or anger. I feel sympathy, an emotion entirely different from the sorrow or anger the other is experiencing. Empathy is my attempt to know, even to feel what you are feeling. Sympathy is my feeling for you. Indeed, empathy can be used for decidedly unsympathetic purposes. Empathy is not simply and inevitably a force for good, the basis of altruism and the source of compassionate understanding. It can also be used to exploit, harm, defeat, and destroy people. Countless examples of the use of empathy for manipulative or hostile purposes might be cited here, ranging from the calculated dig that targets another person's most vulnerable emotional spot, through sophisticated advertising campaigns, to the interrogator who uses empathy to extract information from a suspect. Because empathy is not identification or sympathy, we can empathize with people whom we do not wish to be, and with whom we do not sympathize with, Nazis, for example. Indeed, it is important that we attempt to empathize with such people because their beliefs and behavior frequently do not make immediate or intuitive sense to us. Confronted with an explanatory puzzle, we leave our own observational position and seek to adopt theirs in order to try to understand why their behavior and beliefs made sense to them. To cite one example, I wish to understand how a man ordered to shoot men, women, and children lying naked in a trench could think that order made sense. Although perhaps at the current limit of our empathic capacities, attempting to understand that man is intellectually and ethically imperative. We have an obligation to try to understand that man, not least to avoid dehumanizing him by closing off our empathy for him as he had closed off empathy for those lying helpless before him. Attempting to empathize with the man before the trench transforms him from a simple perpetrator into a multidimensional, if murderous, human being. History written from the empathic position, that is, from the perspective of the historical subject, is different from history written from the external observational position. The external observational position affords the historian the benefit of hindsight and other knowledge inaccessible to the historical subject. That position allows us to know and understand how and why things turned out as they did. By contrast, the empathic observational position allows us to write history that is not deterministic, that illuminates possibility, what might have happened, what the people of the past expected, and not what in fact did occur. To cite another example from the Holocaust, empathic history transforms Jews, reduced to the status of victims, into whole complex human beings with experiences and expectations having nothing at all to do with the fact that their lives ultimately ended in Auschwitz. The empathic position, observational position, allows us to try to see the past as the people of the past saw it, It relinquishes some of the authority that the external observational position affords the historian, granting instead considerably more authority over what the historian knows and writes to the people of the past. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Good evening. I'm looking forward to our time together and learning from you. I'm not a historian, so I look forward to learning in this field. I want to thank Professor Confino for inviting me to join this distinguished group of historians, and also Paz Goldstein, the administrator of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies, for great organizational skills. I'm also going to read my remarks to keep me on track here. It's an honor to join you to discuss Tom Kohut's book, Empathy and the Historical Understanding of the Human Past. I've known Tom for over 20 years through his association with the Erikson Institute of the Austin Riggs Center as a member of the Board of Trustees, the Erikson Council of Scholars, as a teacher, a study group member, a mentor, and most of all, as a friend. I am not a historian, I'm the outlier in this group. I'm participating as a psychoanalyst who works in a psychoanalytic hospital. The Austin Riggs Center is a small, not-for-profit psychiatric and residential treatment center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Our method of understanding and treating our patients is broadly psychoanalytic. Many of our patients have endured various forms of trauma, including the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And certainly having a complex psychiatric illness presents its own challenges and is potentially traumatic. The psychologist and psychoanalyst Erikson treated patients and wrote numerous papers while he worked at the center for the decade of the 1950s. It was at Austin Riggs that he wrote Young Man Luther, a book that comes out of his clinical work with a patient who reminds him of the theologian and reformer Martin Luther, and the conflicts both Erikson's patient and Martin Luther experienced in relation to their fathers, to authority, and to choices of occupation. Erikson knew that to fully understand an individual, the psychoanalyst must also study the historical, the social, and cultural context of that individual's place in history and in their family. He must also, Erikson, have employed empathy to understand his patient and to make the connection to the historical figure of Martin Luther, open to the resonances and similarities and differences across time. Tom's father, as he's told you, the psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut, also sought to develop a method to help psychoanalysts better understand and appreciate how patients with their symptoms and conflicts came to be the way they are in themselves and in the world. Heinz Kohut had tremendous influence on the field of psychoanalysis through his theoretical elaboration of what he termed self-psychology, which he developed through treating patients suffering primarily from narcissistic disturbances. In his theory of self-psychology, he understands that an individual's psychology is in large part a product of the environment that is internalized and transmuted in various ways. And in his clinical work, he learned that the technical use of the analyst's empathy enabled him to better understand the experience of his patients from their point of view, or inside their individual psychology shaped by early experience. Where Freud had described the method of psychoanalysis to rest primarily on free association, Kohut changed the method, declaring that the proper method of psychoanalysis was empathy. Free association is the primary task of the patient, although the analyst is encouraged to pay attention to her own associative networks to the patient's speech. Empathy then becomes the primary mental activity of the analyst, a way of trying to understand the worldview of the analysand and how that worldview has been constructed, from what events, experiences, fantasies, fears, and wishes does this self emerge. As Heinz Kohut said, empathy involves a kind of vicarious introspection. The claim of using empathy as an epistemological way of exploring the inner life of others, both in the present and in the past, has often suffered from misunderstanding, and at times a caricature of empathy is that it is a sloppy type of affect that is better isolated so as not to contaminate the imagined surgical field of sterile, objective, scientific inquiry. This caricature of empathy in part comes, I think, from its association with essential femininity. Edgar Glover, a British psychoanalyst, first attributes empathy to a feminine position in a paper in 1926. And I think once this gender stereotyping and association occurs, there's a subtle and persistent resistance, or at worst a stigma that becomes attached to the use of empathy as a rigorous method of exploring subjectivity in psychoanalysis and other fields. This mischaracterization and marginalization has deprived many fields in the humanities and certainly in the social and human sciences of a powerful tool for investigation of the subject in the name of privileging a kind of objectivity. Tom's work places the human subject and subjectivity into the field of objectivity in facts. Tom's assertion is that understanding the human subject creates an expanded understanding of humans in the past and in history. Tom opens his book with an epigraph by Harper Lee from her book To Kill a Mockingbird. This epigraph is, quote, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." This captures Tom's project, which is to use empathy as a disciplined methodology for historians who are investigating people of the past. In this, Tom defines empathy as, quote, "thinking and feeling and imagining one's way inside the experience of others in order to know and understand them." What might this method deepen and illuminate? In psychoanalysis, we are interested in developmental stories and understanding what both internally and externally motivates a person to behave the way they do. What interpersonal, familial, social, and historical contexts are acting on a person and informing how they in turn see the world and how it informs their choices. In psychoanalysis, we have a near neighbor concept to empathy known as mentalization, which is the precursor to empathy. Mentalization is a theory of mind construct that has to do with how infants and caregivers learn to imagine what another person is thinking in order to make sense of their behavior. It is a process of inference that allows for understanding another's motivations or the state of mind that informs their behavior. One has to have the capacity for mentalization in order to develop empathy, an inferential process of deep knowing. Mentalization and empathy are invaluable to psychologists and psychoanalysts, and I think it is Tom's interdisciplinary training that has allowed him to see and use these tools in the service of researching people of the past, particularly when explaining behavior and decisions is a useful endeavor. This moves the field of inquiry beyond description of what happened to a deeper story of trying to understand the various environmental conditions that may have shaped why people have behaved in a certain manner. The sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild talks about listening for the deep story that people have to tell. And so I think empathy is a way into the deep story. In his book, Tom gives a beautiful discourse on what empathy is and is not. As he said, empathy is different from sympathy, sentimentalism, romanticism, or other expressions of felt connection. It is not merger, identification with, or a response to some type of emotional or ideological contagion. Thus, empathy is differentiated by its boundaried practice and disciplined imagination about the state of mind of another in order to more fully comprehend something about the other person's internal feeling and thinking state in relation to the context they inhabit, or perhaps the context they are inhabited by. Tom's careful explication of the legacy of historical method is one that imagines the people of the past as rational actors, a legacy of positivist Enlightenment thinking that has so pervaded our thinking is familiar to me. Academic psychology also bears this methodological stamp. More recently, though, I think we've had to acknowledge that humans are not simply rational actors. Here is where psychoanalysis might have a useful contribution to make. Psychoanalysis traffics in the unconscious and the irrational. It is an error based on a wish that humans can be primarily and only rational actors. Former Erikson scholar in residence, law professor Ann Daly, takes up this problematic assumption in her book, Law and the Unconscious. The law rests on the assumption that a juror can presume that what any reasonable and rational person would do, when of course our unconscious is not bound by these rational aspirations. Here it is empathy that may help us understand that which is essentially irrational. Or in Tom's case, studying unpopular people of the past, the Nazis, and trying to understand how ordinary people came to be eager to craft a system of violent dehumanization, or what Erik Erikson referred to as pseudo-speciation. In chapter 4 of Tom's book, he examines the 1942 Wannsee Conference, attended by members of the three branches of the Nazi regime, the state, the party, and the SS. Tom is able to identify the perverse use of empathy by the Nazis to try to gauge how far they can take their destructive project before citizens will revolt, as the citizens had with Hitler's early euthanasia program. So this is the misuse of empathy to gauge something about how far they can go. Tom's use of empathy to imagine discussions of the Wannsee Conference allowed him to see these discussions in a new light. In his book, Tom understands the vital importance of examining the individual in a multiplicity of contexts, and that these competing contexts with differing demands create a life of conflict that is then revealed in how people of the past act. Like his father, Tom's work as a historian working in an interdisciplinary manner is shaping your field of history through his careful exploration of how empathy is an epistemological position that deepens the historian's understanding of the human past. It is a project that is worthy of pursuit. Thank you.
Okay. Are we just continuing, Alan? Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. After listening to Jane, I of course have many more thoughts, but I hope I'll be able to articulate them in the discussion. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this really exciting event. I very much enjoyed reading Tom's book, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss it with all of you. I think the book addresses some fundamental questions of historical practice, the role of subjectivity, our own relationship to the past, and also the way in which the past reflects back on us and even has the potential, as Tom argues, to change us. So Tom makes a very good case for a deliberate and self-conscious use of empathy in historical research. He seeks to increase our self-reflexivity, to theorize aspects of our historical research that we have long practiced, but without much self-awareness or methodological reflection. I actually had to think this is sort of similar like the history of emotions. You know, we've always written about emotions, but we've rarely sort of thought about them in a sort of more methodological or theoretical sense. So I'm just gonna first mention a few aspects of the book that I really liked, and then I also will raise a few questions. So besides this plea for more methodological self-reflexivity, I very much like Tom's emphasis on historians' subjectivity. I started my latest book on German Angst with a word that is actually verboten in German historiography, and that's the word I. I reflected upon my own experience of fear in the German peace movement of the 1980s as a starting point for historicizing this emotion in post-war history. But I've also noticed whenever I talk about this, the next impulse is to pull back from subjectivity and to objectify the topic again, to talk about the book's contribution to historiography and all that. And I think this is probably somewhat typical for our discipline because I think historians in general have been more reluctant to embrace their subjectivity, perhaps for good reason, than scholars in neighboring disciplines such as literature or anthropology. But I think Tom's plea for the importance of subjectivity is a very useful corrective to a long tradition in German historiography that has tended to disavow this subjective dimension of historical research. Just think of the first generation of German historians of National Socialism, people like Martin Borchardt, who adopted a pose of objectivity and sobriety. This then not only served to exclude supposedly more emotional Jewish historians from academic discourse, but clearly also functioned as a psychological distancing mechanism. Secondly, I also like the use of empathy to underline the importance of open and multiple futures in the past. I think one of our real professional fallacies is to use our benefit of hindsight, the knowledge of how the story has turned out, in order to pass judgment on our historical protagonists. But unlike us, as Tom says, they did not know their futures. So I think our historical narratives become more variegated, more contingent, also more dramatic, if we consider the open futures of our historical subjects, the what might have beens. As Tom argues convincingly, historical empathy can help us to avoid purely linear and teleological narratives that make history seem inevitable. They help us to avoid what E.P. Thompson famously called the enormous condescension of posterity. And I actually always thought that Marion Kaplan's work is a perfect example for this kind of emphatic reconstruction of the past. Thirdly, I like the use of empathy to address the seemingly irrational, and Jane already alluded to that. It seems to me that historians' invocation of irrationalism often indicates that they have not sufficiently historicized a particular moment. We tend to apply our own contemporary notions of rationality in order to condemn past historical actions as irrational. But empathy can, as Tom argues, allow us to see the inner logic and perhaps the rationality of past historical actions. And I think some of the best historical work has managed to render intelligible, seemingly irrational behavior, often through the use of empathy. So I'm thinking of books like Ruth Harris's book on Lourdes, or even Monica Black's latest book on demons in post-war Germany. Finally, I also like Thomas' nuanced understanding of the concept of empathy. Empathy, like all emotions, is a historical construct whose meanings and functions are never stable. Specific emotions also experience a particular currency at specific moments. So Ute Frevert, for example, has analyzed empathy as the quintessentially modern emotion, and Tom also portrays empathy as laying at the origins of the modern concept of human rights. But he's also right in pointing out the darker sides of empathy, for example, in torture. And more recent research has also demonstrated how empathy can reinforce rather than transcend group identities, mainly because we tend to empathize with other people of similar persuasion or cultural backgrounds. So empathy, like all emotions, does not have an inherent moral or political valence. Its specific meaning and function is defined by the context in which it is mobilized. It serves repressive as well as emancipatory purposes. So I have a lot of praise for this book, and I admire Thomas' courage in taking on such big questions, but perhaps it's also not surprising that such a wide-ranging work also raises some questions. So let me move on to those points. So the first one concerns the use of the category of experience. So it doesn't seem clear to me, for example, that the shift from social to cultural history was one from structure to experience, as Tom seems to argue. It seems to me that the attempt to reconstruct the historical experience of social groups, say women and workers, was very much part of the social history enterprise. As I see it, the shift to cultural history actually implied an increasing skepticism regarding our ability to access unmediated experiences in the past. Foucault's discourse analysis was, of course, important here, and Koselleck actually also argued that experience was always mediated by language. So I think the book is a bit too optimistic regarding our ability to access the experience of historical subjects as a basis for an emphatic reconstruction of the past. Secondly, the book makes extensive use of Koselleck's perhaps most frequently cited categories of the space of experience and the horizon of expectation. And I actually think that this engagement with Koselleck could have been pushed even further, because Koselleck, of course, thinks that these terms are always in a dynamic relationship with each other and that they actually diverged in modernity. So after this Sattelzeit, as he calls it, of the 18th century. So if we follow Koselleck, the space of experience did not really provide much guidance for the horizon of expectation in the 20th century. At least that's its argument. So its reconstruction cannot quite function as a basis for empathy. And maybe this is why Koselleck did not use the term, as Tom also argues. I was also a bit unclear regarding the repeated invocation of universalisms. The notion, and I quote, of certain universal experiences that connect historian and historical subject as a basis for empathy. So what actually are these universal experiences? And perhaps Koselleck might have helped here as well, because he actually sought to identify universal structures in history that kept repeating themselves and therefore also could serve as a basis for empathy because they concern us as well as people in the past. I also very much agree with the need to combine an external with an emphatic point of view. But it's of course important that the one does not come at the expense of the other. So I respectfully disagree a little bit with Tom's analysis of the SPD in 1918, because he argues that the SPD acted the way it did because the party believed that the radical left wanted to emulate the Bolshevik Revolution. But I think we've sort of learned that this was simply not the case, that the left wanted a fuller democratization of German society, not necessarily a dictatorship of the proletariat like in Russia. So the SPD might have believed that, but that was not the historical reality. So I think this also shows that an emphatic reconstruction can run the risk of replicating the misperceptions of historical subjects. I also wonder why the example for the challenges of empathy have to be the mass murderers of the SS. First of all, why not their victims? And I'm also not sure I want to empathize with racist mass murderers, and I'm not sure I have to in order to understand them or to explain their actions. Because I think rather than trying to empathize with them in the act of committing murder, such a sort of extreme situation, I think it probably would be more important to reconstruct how and why they got to that point in the first place. That is to historicize this moment as the end point of an entire series of always contingent historical and biographical processes. And finally, I'm not sure I entirely agree with the portrayal of the history of emotions. I don't think the history of emotions is only interested in the, quote, cultural function of emotions. I think this was true for older approaches of emotionology as practiced, for example, by Peter and Carol Stearns. So more recent approaches, I think, are much more interested in the interrelationship between emotional norms and emotional experiences. And I think one reason for the interest in the history of emotions is that it seemed to promise a way out of this post-structuralist conundrum regarding discourse and experience, issues that cultural historians tended to struggle with. So a focus on emotions seemed to promise a way to the inner reality of historical actors. And in that sense, the history of emotions perhaps represents an alternative approach to access the psyche of historical actors. an alternative approach to the one that I think Thomas seems to propose in this book, because the way he describes it, this sort of reconstruction of the psychic reality of historical actors consists in a kind of mental exercise on the part of the historian that then enables him or her to access historical actors' unconscious and to understand them better than they understood themselves, in analogy to the therapeutic situation. But I think the history of emotions would take emotions as a kind of outward manifestation of historical actors' invisible inner reality. For someone like William Reddy, the expression of an emotion is actually an integral part of the emotion. So I would argue that the history of emotions seeks to identify tangible manifestations of emotions, mostly through language, but also visually or through sound, and thus perhaps seeks to find a firmer empirical ground for the reconstruction of the inner reality of historical actors. And finally, my last point, so Tom's method of emphatic understanding, as I read it, actually also has a very strong sort of cognitivist bent. It's geared towards reconstructing the thoughts and intentions, maybe also the feelings of past historical actors. But I wonder how we can emphasize not just with thoughts and intentions, but also with past practices of historical actors. So I'm not sure this sort of distinction between activity and experience is as absolute as you described it, Tom. So, I mean, sometimes you could say that actions speak louder than words, and the idea would be to emphasize less with what historical subjects say they do, but with what they actually do. And I think this might be important, especially because Tom also seemed to be interested in moving away from what he calls a, quote, cultural Cartesianism. So he argues that we can free ourselves from our cultural context with the force of the imagination. But this also seems to attach a lot of importance to the emancipatory potential of the human mind and to the idea of a sort of autonomous self, which seems to be the basis of this exercise of empathy. So in a way, this sounds pretty Cartesian to me as well. And I wonder if there are other ways of practicing historical empathy than solely relying on the force of the imagination. And that would see empathy not just as an exercise of the mind, but also as a historical practice. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm actually picking up a little bit with it. None of us spoke with each other, but I'm picking up a little bit from Frank's issue of the cognitive dimension. So let me start. This exciting and challenging book details empathy as a way of knowing, of trying to get inside the perspective of people from the past. Tom argues brilliantly how empathic perspectives focus on past subjective experiences to understand past texts, expressions, and actions. Plainly put, empathy has a cognitive dimension, a way of seeing and observing that uncovers the world beyond the individual. Tom suggests sich hineinfühlen, trying, and the emphasis is on trying, to step in an historical actor's shoes without becoming her. For example, Tom points to Alon's A World Without Jews and to Tom's own book, A German Generation, both of which analyze the appeal of Nazism and what Germans told themselves, their self-deceptions that justified persecuting Jews. Similar to scholars who study the radical right today, these authors didn't have to be like Nazis, let alone like them, to understand them. Tom contributes also to the relatively new, I guess it's not that new, history of emotions. I think that today this history encompasses how people felt too, not just the older definition, what their societies defined or expressed as emotions. The history of emotions has evolved. My students and colleagues read it as an opening to understand the feelings of historical actors and communities. What did it feel like to be alive at that time? The poet Gertrude Kolmar, later murdered in Auschwitz, cautioned her readers, "You hear me speak. Can you also hear me feel?" Indeed, this was not merely a caution. I think she was begging us to become empathic readers. Using the Holocaust as an example, it seems to me that an attempt at empathy is what historians of Jewish victims do, far more, as Tom noted, than most historians of perpetrators or enablers. In the past decades, publishers and museums have offered a plethora of materials that give first-person observations and feelings during persecution. We all know that these ego documents, whether memoirs, diaries, or letters, are fallible. They can be episodic and selective. They can reflect current expectations and biases. And for every storyteller, there are often counter stories to be told. I acknowledge the instability of memory and defend ego documents in everything I write. And yet, these are among the very few ways we can try to step into Jewish shoes during the Holocaust. Or, as I've noted, they can help us approach the lives of our historical subjects asymptotically, like a curve that comes closer and closer to a line, but never quite reaches it. Nevertheless, there are stumbling blocks. Can historians use bifocal vision to step into another's shoes and still maintain their current perspective? Fear may serve as an example of the difficulties of empathic knowing as a form of cognition. Can historians really tell the difference between fear, anger, or even hatred when a refugee approached a recalcitrant consul official? And can we distinguish between fear, often mentioned in personal writing, and anxiety, even if psychologists may do so? Indeed, what is fear for one individual or group may be anxiety for another. German language sources, and Frank can certainly confirm this, German language sources confuse this issue even more, since Angst means both. Further, in my research, refugees might write about their fear in diaries, letters, and memoirs, even as they acted with hope and persistence. Ego documents form a collage of displacement, frustration, and fear during escapes, along with self-control, agency, and resilience. By adopting refugees' perspectives, we find a melange of feelings, terrified and hopeful, firm and fleeting. These ego documents are utterly crucial in a quest for empathic readings. For example, how refugees experienced and expressed their feelings at the time, quote, "Every door and portal is firmly locked and bolted, and so is every heart." And how they wrote about their bodies, quote, "My heart was pounding and my mouth was very dry," alerts us to their emotional state, and one step further, may even help us begin to understand how emotions might drive decisions to go or to stay put. Indeed, such feelings also alert us to the context. When a refugee stands at a border, we learn not only of her anxieties and hopes, but of the trains, cars, guards, and panicked crowds encircling her. Beyond the important theoretical contributions of Tom's book, I want to raise some practical issues. In my book about refugees, I was interested in two interrelated topics: how refugees felt and how they saw and understood Portuguese people. The topic of how refugees felt meant using the words and deeds of the refugees themselves, and often finding astounding contradictions, as I just mentioned. They expressed fear, panic, yet their actions showed resilience, clarity, even humor. Further, even as these refugees participated in a demoralizing routine of waiting for visas, begging for ship tickets, etc., they created caring communities and shared moods and information in cafes. Then there's the second issue. Could refugees empathize with their Portuguese neighbors? Of course, they focused on their own trauma at first. Still, many fearing the Portuguese police, acknowledged the warm, friendly, and hospitable Portuguese people. Observations of Portuguese generosity abound. At the borders, poor peasants brought bread and fruit to the hapless crowds. They opened their homes to shelter refugees and distributed huge pots of soup, even though refugees were often penniless. People in all walks of life helped out. Refugees often asked why. Why were the Portuguese so kind to strangers? Indeed, some refugees, trying to put themselves into the shoes of their benefactors to understand why they felt or acted as they did, came up with some ideas. Refugee writer George Roney offered an empathic explanation given him by a middle-class Portuguese villager. Roney's host refused money for Roney's family's bed and board and explained, quote, "The people of Portugal are poor, very poor, but they have a deep understanding and compassion for those who are more miserable than they. We will always share bread with strangers who need it." Roney was convinced. It sounds to me like what Martha Nussbaum called imagining being in the sufferer's place, but understanding they're not in that place. And that's from Tom's book. Anthropologists, too, much as Tom noted, suggest that walking in another person's shoes can create empathy. And social psychologists, too, have shown that in experiments, lower class subjects evince greater empathy than upper class subjects toward the suffering of others. Trying to further understand the generous Portuguese, I used a bit of imagination, which is a strong theme in Tom's book. But imagination worried and worries me. I wrote, perhaps Portuguese empathy was aroused by the emotional and physical distress they witnessed. But that leads to my worries about imagination. The use of imagination, what might have occurred, as in the Wannsee Conference, which is an example in Tom's book, made me uncomfortable unless it was used in a super carefully way, suggesting possible hypotheses, but admitting to no data as of yet, which is exactly what Tom does. To some extent, historians do this while thinking about their topics, and then they pursue their suspicions and either find the data to support those ideas or drop them. But this is usually invisible, and Tom asks us to make that process visible. My second worry about imagination is trying to imagine ourselves being them, but remaining ourselves. This may be easier said than done. We can't expect all historians to go through psychoanalytic training. For me, depending on refugees' own words, allowed them to speak out without my speaking as if I, as I am today, were in their shoes then. Rather than put ourselves, quote, imaginatively into their context to bring the past to life in us, maybe we have to be more modest, attempting to use their words to help the reader. Is that a cop-out? And then there is another issue which needs addressing. In the case of the Holocaust, a number of the historians of the Jewish genocide are survivors or children of survivors. Tom writes that, quote, our own experiences enable us to empathize with the experiences of others, experiences different from our own, but sufficiently related, which can help us, quote, think our way inside them. Many Holocaust scholars, myself included, did not have to imagine a whole lot. Eva Hoffman wrote, quote, some of us grew up in rubble, others knew only stories, all came into a ravaged world and the sadness of parents, which, as Roger Free noted, had crossed generations. Could we be too close? In the case of the Holocaust, ethnic cleansing, or enslavement, past people, quote, project themselves onto us because many historians have lived with them. Could such connections make it too easy to step into another space of experience? Can scholars really grapple with the gulf separating them from their grandparents? And gulf is on 121. It's the idea is you have a gulf between yourself and the historical subject. If historians, according to John Demos, work on topics rooted in the self, can there perhaps be too much empathy? What Tom calls merger. For example, memoirs of children of survivors and even third generation memoirs often feel themselves into their relatives' shoes. There seems to be little awareness of otherness, and thus more merger, even appropriation, than an attempt to adopt the position of the other. In that case, is there the danger of making the historical subject's suffering into our own? Conversely, Tom reflected that our emotional engagement with the past, quote, could make it harder for us to imagine ourselves in the place of the people of the past. Tom is completely correct in my case. I focused on refugees. They were easier to study with empathic engagement. For me, it would have been too scary to step inside the experiences of the murdered victims, the true others. Would empathy have helped me appreciate their differences from me? To conclude, this book is an extremely important challenge to the historian's consciousness and craft. Executed well, explicitly and critically, with all the nuances that Tom has urged upon us, empathy will improve historians' efforts to bring complex historical actors and actions to life. Thank you.
Thank you all. Tom, please.
Well, I don't really know what to say. I mean, there's just been so many wonderful ideas, so many things I'd never thought of before. Just, it's sort of a little overwhelming, actually, I think. And, one of the things that writing or researching the book and then doing the reading for the book and then writing it, I mean, it made me feel pretty modest because there was so much that is really hard to understand that I'm perfectly willing to admit that I do not fully understand and have not been able to think through to complete clarity. And, just a couple of really interesting things that were said today, about empathizing with actions. It's just something I'd never, ever thought about is that one could somehow, as was pointed out, I think by both Marion and Frank, that, I'm very cognitive. I'm trying very much to get inside the heads of people and trying to understand their thought processes, and I think also to some extent their emotional responses, but probably ultimately with an aim to get at their, to cognitively understand them, less to kind of identify their emotional state. That has not been something that I thought that much about. But in any event, I don't kind of lost the train of thought here, but I think it's, I'd never thought about how one might empathize with actions. And the other thing, Marion, you just said that I hadn't thought about exactly is the relationship between quotation and empathy. When you quote someone, is that empathizing with them? It certainly is presenting their voice. And I think this may be a part of me and the psychoanalytic part of me, and maybe I think it's also a part of me, the historian, of wanting always to go somewhat beneath the surface, to go beyond what they say, to understand what they really mean. I think there's a kind of an allure of wanting to do that. The other thing I just, in relation to Frank, what you said in the beginning, I think someone else needs to write a book about the word or the concept of experience, because that concept seems to me every bit as capacious and squishy and unclear as empathy does, maybe even more so. I did look at certain texts on experience, but I found it very, very hard to unpack. And again, if you think about the German, the word experience in English is one word, but in German, there are several words that are kind of Wahrnehmung, Erfahrung. I mean, these are different words that break apart or unpack experience in ways that in English, I clearly was using experience to cover up, pull things together that maybe should have been kept apart. I think that's, and then I completely accept the that what the piece in there on the history of emotions was, I was thinking of leaving it out actually in the beginning, but to be perfectly honest, and I doubt he's on this webinar, the contemptuous dismissal of empathy by this guy named William V. Harris got me so annoyed that I put that in. But it was really interesting because I was on a similar thing like this with Ute Freyberg earlier this year about empathy, and she was very clear about her not thinking that empathy is what she's particularly interested in, and that she was quite open about the fact that when she wrote her book on dueling, she was not particularly interested in empathizing. She was not interested, and she stated it baldly, in empathizing with the duelers. She was really interested in the activity of dueling, not so much in the people who were doing the dueling. I mean, I guess for me, what interests me about history has always been people. And I'm interested in emotion, personally, I'm interested in emotions to the extent that they're the emotions that people had. Frank, you wrote, I honestly think it's a brilliant book. And you do talk about emoting people, but you also talk about emotions disaggregated from people at certain points in the book. And I think that's perfectly, it's outstanding actually, the way that's done. But I tend to be more interested in people, I think, in history. And that's where I think, so I'd be interested in the history of emotions to the extent that it's people having emotions. So that was on the history of emotions. The other thing, I guess I wanted to say, I mean, there's so much I could say here. One thing, Frank, you mentioned this, and this really pulls together two things that you said. You said, that's really important, that historians appreciate their own subjectivity in studying the past. And I have, in general, I have to say, tended to focus on what you might call, for lack of a better word, on perpetrators and not so much on victims. And I think the answer, and Marion, you and I have actually emailed about this, I find it really emotionally difficult to focus on the victims, on the Jews. And my next project is going to try to do that, but there is something about, it's not just, sometimes the obstacle to empathy is not, cognitive, it's emotional. And, it's very hard for me to imagine being in the place of Jews, even, Marion, your book is kind of, it made me feel good because you present Jewish refugees in Portugal, and you present very clearly that although we know most of them would end up fine, they did not know that. And you convey beautifully their own insecurities and anxieties and fears, that in a way that even though we know it's going to be probably okay for them, you still can feel along with them how difficult it was. Anyway, maybe I'll stop there because I think there's so much that you've all said, and I could go through and try to respond to every single thing. But I think for me, what was most enlightening was to think about quotations, to think about empathizing with actions, and maybe to revisit the history of emotions in a way. It's still going to always have to have some cognitive dimension, because I don't think one can have emotions without language. And once one has language, it does, I think, to some extent become cognitive. But definitely, I think there is a kind of, I don't know what the right word is, historical kinship between empathy and the history of emotions, that we're trying to get at, what Jane, get away from the notion of human beings as rational actors, where one person, you put two people in the same situation, two different people, and behave in exactly the same way, that kind of assumption. I think that there's a kind of emotional kinship between the history of emotions and empathy, which has at least the potential to be more attentive to individuality and singularity. Yeah, so I guess that's all I'll say for the moment, and there's probably more that will come up during the questions.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, everyone. So I'd like to begin with a question that each one of you can answer, and it is, to what extent is empathy for pre-modern actors inherently different from that for modern ones? And it reminds me of Jane's mentioning of Erikson's book on the young Luther. So as historians, do we see a difference here, maybe simply by virtue of the fact that for us, empathy is a very important concept, whether it was also important for pre-modern actors, and if yes, in what way? That is, maybe we need to historicize. That's actually what I want to say.
Mm-hmm.
What empathy means.
So I'll just say something quickly. I think, because Kozelek, who Frank uses Kozelek's concepts really well in his book, and I use them all the time in teaching, actually, and teach critique and crisis, which Frank, you also alluded to in my methods course. Now where was I going with this? Anyway, I think someone could write a Begriffsgeschichte, a history of the concept of empathy. I think it would be really interesting to see. I mean, I did a little of that, but I think just, what was there such a concept in the early modern period is a really, really interesting question. There have been studies that discuss empathy across cultures in our own world, and showing the way that empathy is thought of differently in different cultures. So I think that's interesting. But and this goes maybe a little bit to the history of emotions. One of my favorite books is Lucien Febvre's The Religion of Rabelais, which is an attempt through Rabelais and his reception, to reconstruct a world of 16th century France that was, in his view, saturated with religion. And I find it an incredibly, deeply empathic book. But it is a lot about emotions, and it's about what it's like to live without clocks, and what it's like to have no electric light or to be without heat. And he draws certain conclusions about psychology, which are a little problematic based on like the weather and how people were susceptible to the weather. But I think there is a certain, deeply empathic quality to that book. I think it's one of the best history books ever written. That isn't exactly cognitive in the way that I think I presented empathy in my book.
So Henry Greenspan is asking, as a psychoanalytic psychologist and playwright, I'm wondering about the role of literary imagination in the service of empathy, especially regarding craft. A playwright, for example, deliberately interrogates characters via improvisation, multiple questions, and imagined answers, and so on. Can you say more, Tom, about specific practices that an empathically oriented historian would pursue? And actually, it's not only for Tom, this question.
Jane, do you want to say something about that one?
I'm reading the question again to make sure I understand it. I don't know that much about being a playwright, that's for sure. But I do think that empathy, the argument in psychology is it innate or can it be taught? Can you learn how to be empathic in some way? And I think, a playwright, it sounds like, creates characters in order to develop a kind of empathy with them, to differentiate them from one another, to imbue them with a story. But I don't know exactly how that method would work. I'm sure it's specific to training as a playwright about how character development takes place. And I'm sure, Tom, I would think for historians, there would be a kind of training for how one uses empathy and its misuses, because anytime you have a methodology that allows you to engage your craft, whether it's being a psychoanalyst, a historian, a playwright, within that guild, I think there are certain guideposts about how empathy would be deployed. And I think that's what your book is trying to do, is to say something that, how might this be deployed in the service of deepening our understanding of people of the historical past?
Well, the one thing I would say, what I don't, at least, again, I'm older, and I went to a Big Ten university, and the imagination was never once mentioned in my entire graduate education as a historian. Empathy was certainly never mentioned. Basically, what I did as a graduate student was write book review after book review after book review, developing my abilities to critique. And
perhaps it was not mentioned also in other schools, Tom, many years ago.
No.
So it has little to do with the Big Ten.
I know. I'm sorry. You're right. It has nothing to do with it. But Minnesota was the home of incredibly social sciencey disciplines. But leaving the Big Ten, it was never mentioned. There was no effort to train us to use our imagination. And I have to say, I get, Marion, what your concerns about imagination. But to me, I think, one of the things that I personally love about history, and I think that I try to convey to my students in teaching, is the role that the imagination can play in helping us to recreate in our mind past worlds and the people who lived in them. And I think that, even at Williams, and I wouldn't be surprised if this weren't true at the other schools represented here, the kind of mantra about what we're doing is to teach our students critical thinking, which is basically critique, I think. And I'm not sure that critical thinking and understanding are necessarily exactly the same. And I'm not sure that critical thinking and empathy actually line up all the time. So I think that there's obviously an enormously important place for critical thinking and for critiquing, but I think there's also a place for empathy and for understanding. And that is not part of our kind of mantra that is repeated endlessly at Williams. And I think it would be really interesting to think about how one would, that response to the question, and I don't have an answer to it, is how one would teach graduate students, I certainly do it with my undergraduates. I make them try to imagine their way inside the experience of the people of the past, but I'm not sure that's what I taught I was doing when I was a graduate student.
It's a question I have as an outsider is how much are you doing that, but there's a prohibition against saying that you're doing that.
Well, I wanted to respond to Tom's question about how to teach graduate students this practice. And I think you gave the answer yourself. It's by assigning your book, because I think it is a wonderful, as you called it, a wonderful primer for this problem of empathy. And maybe just one more point going back to Alon's first question. It seems to me in the book and also in our discussion, there's sort of two levels. The one is, we're talking about the role of empathy in history, but then we're also talking about empathy as a historical practice. And the two are, of course, not the same things, although maybe they are also related. And, this question about our ability for empathy in the early modern period, maybe it would also help to, again, think with Koselleck about the temporality of empathy. You have sort of moments when perhaps historical actors, it was easier for them to anticipate the future. And then there are moments when, you know, it was very difficult to anticipate what would happen the next month or next year or so. I guess we live through this in the present as well. You know, we don't know what's going to happen with the next virus variant and what that will do to us. So that might perhaps also be a way to differentiate between the maybe the different ways in which we can practice empathy as historians. Thank you.
I would add one other thing. Can you hear me? Okay. I would add one other thing, which is when I think about using the words, obviously, of modern people who have left us a lot of their materials, I'm not teaching students just to look at their words, but also to look at their deeds, which are often the opposite of their words. I think that's really important. So in other words, don't just take it for granted that what they say is what you're going to report back in your term paper, but also what they did or what they were doing as they were trembling. What were they trying to achieve, so that you get a more complex picture. And that's what I think I try to teach my students. But imagining is another step further, which I haven't really taken. I've said read between the lines, which is a little bit like imagining, but it's still somewhat different because you can base it on the two lines. So I'm still a little uncomfortable with the imagining itself.
So maybe we have many questions. Maybe I'll choose two. They are not connected, and each one of you can pick and choose, you know. So one is by Jeffrey Gold, who wonder if the panel might comment on Hannah Arendt and empathy in regards to the controversies about Eichmann in Jerusalem. And another one is by Susanna Heschel, who asks, Tom, but we can open up this question to everybody. In listening to your description of empathy, I wonder what do you think of Thomas Ogden's understanding of the intersubjectivity between analyst and analysand that creates thirdness? Would thirdness have a useful role for the historian? Does historical scholarship steeped in empathy create thirdness? And is thirdness applicable and useful to historical work? I know these are very different questions, and maybe not so much. Jane, would you like to take a stab on it?
I will take a stab. The concept of thirdness in psychoanalysis is a way of identifying something that is beyond the dyad of analysand and analyst. What is that? And it's been thought of in different ways. So I think Ogden thinks of it as an emergent property of the dyad. Thirdness is what emerges from the co-constructed or co-created space within that. My work in thirdness mostly comes from my mentor and colleague John Muller's idea of a structural third, and that is something that comes before or stands, that the dyad is embedded in. It's not created by the dyad, it's created by language, by customs, laws, rituals, things that precede any dyad and make the dyad's work possible. But I think the question has something to do with what kind of thirdness might emerge from a historian engaging with the imagined or textual subjectivity of a person of the past as it emerges in existing documents or stories about that person. I think it's hard as an analyst for me to imagine that, because it's not clear to me how dynamic back and forth that engagement with a person of the past can be. You've got a fixed text or a fixed document that is not shifting and changing and moving in relation to the historian, as one might see in an analytic process where the hypotheses are provisional, the resonances are shifting all the time. So I think it would be hard to get to a kind of analytic thirdness in historical inquiry, but perhaps with more thought, I would understand better how that could happen. But on the spot, it's hard to see without the dynamic subject of inquiry being present, how to do that.
I mean, I've never actually fully understood the concept of the third, to be perfectly honest, so I'm not sure I can comment on it, but I think one of the things Frank's mentioned that is really important to me in thinking about the relationship between the historian and the people of the past is that, I think normally historians think that they have the power really, and that they have the power for ill oftentimes to impose themselves on the past and to see their own, contemporary preoccupations kind of projected onto past people. But I think one of the things that I believe strongly is that the past has a big influence on us and can change us. This is an idea that I think has been really powerfully articulated by Dominic LaCapra. And that we are not, it's not just that historians impose themselves on history, but history imposes itself on historians and changes them. So there is, in that sense, a certain dynamic relationship, I'd say, Jane, between the past, which is not inert and which is not powerless, and which does, this is where the quotations come in. That, when we read, there's not just one document there. In what you see at different moments in different documents is based in some way on the power of the texts, not just simply on our own power over the texts. And I think that that's something that's really an important thing to emphasize.
Any final words of wisdom?
Well, the only thing I would just say is just how amazingly rich this was and how incredibly smart everybody's comments were, and how, just how many really, really interesting things there are to think about. And that I think it's just really important that, historians are never like superstars at being theoretically self-aware. We just tend to do it, do history and then hope for the best. And I certainly am guilty of that too. But I think, that being aware of our use of empathy, of the relationship between empathy and judgment, about the fact that we do shift back and forth, I think, all the time between being ourselves and imagining being other people. And then I think it's really important to be aware of, if you're imagining being if you're imagining being people in the past, which particular people are you imagining you are at this particular moment? I got this from teaching undergraduates at Williams in tutorials, like just the importance of keeping the voices straight. When are you speaking? When are you speaking on behalf of one of the people that you're studying? And which particular person's voice are you speaking? Which particular person are you speaking for at any given moment? So there's this, this panel, I think, has been really, or this webinar has been just great in trying to elevate our self-consciousness about what we do as historians and also psychoanalysts. And I think that's really makes me feel really good.
One of the great takeaway points from the book, for me, and we said it in different ways, is that we historians, we explore the past, we explain it, and then we understand it, or we think we understand it. We hope so. But what Tom is trying to say in his book, among others, is that this past that we explore and understand is actually a vehicle to understand ourselves. And it is these reciprocal relations which oftentimes we don't do as historians, because we don't see it as part of our job. We understand the past, but the past is not going to be a vehicle to understand myself in the same way that if you go to a psychologists, so you speak about your past in order to understand yourself. And it is this, it's not only the impact of the past that we study on us is something. How exactly to do it is not easy, but I thought this was very, very interesting. And of course, each one of us is exploring a certain subject for a reason, even if it's in the medieval history or ancient Rome. And perhaps all our life we write one book, but in different ways. Even if the subjects are different, we write the book that we are. We write the books that we are. And it is this that makes us aware, actually, of how rich our profession is. So I thank Tom and I thank all of you. It was a fascinating discussion, and I thank our audience that bared with us staying so late. Thank you so much.